Today's book is called, actually I have the wrong book here, it's this one, Implementing the Lexical Approach, Putting Theory into Practice by Michael Lewis. Implementing the lexical approach is a follow-up to the lexical approach. Now, the lexical approach is a book I've already reviewed. In fact, it was my very first video review, and there is a lot of stuff in here, and I rambled on and on and on and on until I hit the 30-minute mark, at which point the camera automatically shut off. My camera I'm using only does 30-minute videos for whatever reason. Implementing the lexical approach also has a lot of complicated stuff in here, so there's a potential for me to ramble on and on and on here as well, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to try as much as possible. These two books cover a lot of the same ground. That is, a lot of the points that are made in the lexical approach are also kind of made in the implementing the lexical approach. And I'm going to try not to cover the same ground too much in my review. I don't want to repeat myself too much from last time. But for the purposes of making this review stand independently, I will kind of back up and give some background. So, the lexical approach was published by Michael Lewis in 1993. Some people say he was kind of building on the work of other people like Dave Willis before him. But yeah, be that as it may, this is a book that kind of came out in 1993, and it advocated what appeared to be kind of like a radical new way of teaching language. There were several components in there, but at its most basic, he's arguing for somewhat of a different view of language acquisition. Something that had been kind of, again, he wasn't the first person to do this, it had been kind of growing in popularity throughout the 80s with people who were interested in like the corpus of spoken data and stuff like that. Dave Willis again. But it was in opposition to Chomsky's model of generative grammar. Whereas Chomsky's model is the human brain has an innate capacity for grammar. If you get exposed to a lot of language, the human brain just automatically sorts the grammar out, and then there's this kind of miracle of speaking. What people began to notice when they looked at the corpus data of kind of spoken language is people tend to speak in kind of set phrases a lot. The same kind of phrases just kind of keep popping up. So there's the theory that these phrases are not stored as individual words, they're stored in the brain as a phrase. Or rather, that phrase is kind of stored as one word, the same way kind of one word would be stored. And when we're speaking, especially when we're, speaking in real time, like I'm doing now, without kind of having prepared remarks beforehand, we'll tend to kind of grab these kind of pre-made phrases from our brain. We have, according to this theory, it's a dual system, according to this theory. So we do have kind of the grammar part as well, the Chomsky generative grammar or whatever. But we also have part of our brain that has these prefabricated lexical phrases. And because of the pressures of real-time production, our brain will find it easier to kind of grab these pre-made phrases rather than kind of building up every sentence from scratch from the base elements. They also argue in this book that once this, not only do we have the system, but this is kind of the key to language acquisition. Children kind of learn these phrases before they learn grammar. So like a child would learn like, what's that? Meaning kind of what is that? But they don't learn it as what is that, they learn it as what's that. They learn these phrases as a whole, and then, Michael Lewis argues, once it's learned as a whole, then the brain or the grammar system or whatever can kind of break it down into its individual parts, and that's where the grammar comes from. So not only does he argue that this is true for learning our first language, he argues that this is true for learning the second language, or at least it is for effective language learners, meaning like this is how we should kind of teach languages. Some of that actually, now that I've said all that, some of that comes through clearer in implementing the lexical approach, but it is kind of in both books. He also, another kind of part of this is he thinks kind of lexis. Lexis, by the way, means, it means vocabulary, but it means vocabulary in the broad sense. So not only individual words, but also phrases, which are kind of stored as one unit. So phrases and words, kind of meaning lexis, is that this is much more useful than grammar. So for example, like when somebody learning a foreign language, when the communication breaks down, when they can't say what they want to say, or when they don't understand what the input that's coming at them, it's not because of grammar reasons, 99% of the time. It's because of vocabulary or lexis reasons. And you know, in my anecdotal experience, this is 100% true. If this is the case, why are we spending all of our time teaching grammar? Why not kind of focus all of our time building up vocabulary and lexis? Especially because, as kind of Michael Lewis points out in both of these books, a lot of the grammar structures that English textbooks teach to students aren't even really used in real life. Reported speech is his kind of favorite example. It's taught like in every textbook ever, and it's if you go through the corpus data, native speakers very seldom use this kind of structure to actually report speech. They either tend to kind of paraphrase what was said, or kind of summarize what was said, or just kind of quote it directly. This whole thing on the reported speech where you have to kind of put the present tense verb into the past tense, and kind of all these rules that textbooks have for reported speech is rarely used. It does not seem to justify the amount of time that we spend teaching it in English learning curriculums. So that kind of theory is spread across both books. What separates implementing the lexical approach from the lexical approach is this book is much more focused on implementing. It's got the first 4 chapters are kind of, he's setting forth his theory, and that's heavily overlaps with the lexical approach, although he's got some new things he's going on about here. For example, there's a chapter dedicated to the role of L1 in the lexical approach. I think that's hinted at in the original book, but this is kind of much more expanded and largely new. But then chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 are 5, 6, and 7 are practical ideas, and chapter 8 is classroom reports from, I think, a number of people who tried out the lexical approach in their classroom. And you can tell just kind of flipping through the book, if you can see this on the camera, just the number of kind of practical ideas here, even including, you know, stuff you can photocopy with you and take directly into the classroom, like this. So this is a huge improvement over the original, the lexical approach. I think one of the main complaints people had of the lexical approach back in the day, although I didn't read it back in the day, but back in the day I think a big complaint people had about it was it did not offer any practical suggestions on how to implement it. This book has lots of practical suggestions. Although, yeah, actually let me talk about another thing here. There is an interesting article, which if you're reading these books, I recommend you look up, called The Lexical Approach, A Journey Without Maps by Scott Thornberry, which is kind of a critique of the lexical approach. It's, again, mainly focused on these 2 books and also an article Michael Lewis wrote in 1996, which I've not read. But Scott Thornberry in this article is of the opinion, and I think I kind of agree with him, that the lexical approach kind of starts off promising a revolution. Like, this is a whole new way of teaching it. The old curriculum's out, new curriculum's in, but then didn't really give any guidance about how to implement that. Implementing the lexical approach has lots of ideas for practical activities, but it's very good if you want to supplement a lesson. Like, okay, and at the end of this lesson I'm going to do a activity on collocation. Find something here. It's kind of less effective if you're going to redesign your whole way of teaching and kind of make a syllabus. And Scott Thornberry points out that in this book he seems to be backing off kind of the revolution. He says it's not a revolution. You don't have to change the way you generally teach. Just kind of change it and supplement it with some of the activities in here. This article is great. Whether you agree with it or not, Scott Thornberry writes really well, and he gets up with a few zingers in here. Kind of one of the zingers he gets off is, where is it? Teachers, however, who may have been won over by Lewis's hatchet job on traditional grammar syllabuses and PPP methodology, which, yeah, like, you are kind of, as you read through his books, you're like, yeah, tell them all they're wrong, might feel somewhat shortchanged by such reassurances and argue that surely such a radical agenda demands major, not minor, adjustments to classroom practice. And however he might now wish to retract his initial claims that the lexical approach suggests a radically different view of methodology, the fact is that by calling it an approach with a capital A, moreover, rather than, say, techniques for teaching chunking, he runs the risk of it being evaluated as such. So, you know, if you're going to call it an approach, just kind of, you're going to have to evaluate it as an approach. There's a line right at the beginning here, which I thought was interesting, and this got a good laugh out of the book club. We did this book as a book club book. I forgot to mention that. Anyways, I thought this was funny. It says, implementing the lexical approach in your classes does not mean a radical upheaval likely to upset colleagues, parents, and learners. On the contrary, if introduced with thought and sensitivity, its introduction will be almost invisible, involving perhaps 20 or even 50 small changes in every lesson. So, you don't have to change anything. It'll be almost invisible. All you have to do is change 20 or 50 things in every lesson. I mean, like, I'm not even sure I do 50 things in every lesson. You know, like, I mean, yeah, I guess if you count, like, every single word you say or something. But, like, I mean, like, it's a little bit kind of hard to tell what he's advocating. Is he advocating a major switch, or just a few supplementary activities, or 50 small changes in every lesson? I don't know. So kind of, I guess, from a holistic kind of view, these books can be frustrating, but that's the glass half empty side of it. The glass half full size is that Michael Lewis is always interesting to read because he has really strong opinions. Now, whether all of his ideas are practical or not, or whether he's entirely consistent or not, is another question. But just kind of from a readability standpoint, I mean, I think here's my takeaway: if you're trying to make kind of a unifying sense out of Michael Lewis's books, you're going to be frustrated. But if you're looking for gems of insight, just kind of little interesting bits of insight, then these books are quite rich in them. And if you're looking for maybe not a unifying approach, but some good activities, this book has them. Now, the trade-off with a book that's full of activities is it can be boring to read. I know I just said he was never boring to read, but actually the sections of this book were boring to read. Chapter 5, 6, and 7, and 8 were a little bit boring to read. Chapters 1 to 4, when he was kind of laying out the theory, was interesting. And then, for whatever reason, he always ends his books. He did this with the original lexical approach as well. He always ends his books with a big rant about how everybody's doing everything wrong and we need to change it in the future. And he does that here as well. So chapters kind of 9, 10, and 11 are saying, okay, everything you've learned about teaching is wrong. PPP methodology doesn't work. Decreased teacher talking time is nonsense. Error correction is anti-educational. So he goes out kind of that rant at the end. But the middle chapters are a little bit boring, but they're quite practical. Yeah, it's a trade-off, isn't it? If you know, again, this is a professional development book, so it's not supposed to be pleasure reading. We were saying at the book club, you know, like the lexical approach was really interesting, but not practical. Implementing the lexical approach had some chapters which were not so interesting, the middle chapters, but very practical. I guess you kind of have to pick one or the other. Either you complain that it's not practical, or you can complain that it's not interesting. So of these kind of more practical chapters, some of them I thought, this is never going to work. And some of them I thought, yeah, that works. In fact, I'm going to try that this week. Stuff that I was very skeptical about getting to work had a lot to do with encouraging students to keep vocabulary journals or vocabulary notebooks and update it and organize them effectively. And I have some experience with this because at my former job, for a while, like a year and a half, there was a big push to do vocabulary notebooks in the upper level classes. And I'm not even sure why. I suspect maybe one of the managers maybe had read Michael Lewis or something like that. So the school printed out kind of official vocabulary notebooks that had the school logo on them, and then there were ways to record the words and stuff like that. Each student got a free vocabulary notebook at the beginning of the term, and then we teachers were encouraged. There was like a lesson in the curriculum about teaching the students how to organize a vocabulary notebook, which I did because I didn't know any better when I was new. And I went through that and I said, okay, it was, as a lot of these lessons are, it was kind of student-centered. So I was trying to elicit from them ways that they can record vocabulary, and then brainstorming ways together, and then we set up this vocabulary notebook. They were supposed to read 2 articles a week and record vocabulary in their vocabulary notebook, and just none of them did it. Initially I was supposed to go around and check that they were keeping the vocabulary notebook, and they're like, oh, no, I forgot mine. I left it at home today. Or they'd have it and they hadn't recorded anything, or you know, they were quickly recording something right before class. And you know, it's just like this idea of a vocabulary notebook. It's so great in theory, but like it's impossible to get students to actually do it. Now, like, I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm sure, like, in a class of 100 students, there may be, like, I don't know, 3, 4 that are really motivated and are going to keep very nice vocabulary notebooks. But kind of as, like, something that you're going to kind of take to the mass market English language teaching world and kind of do it on a large scale with a lot of students, they're just not going to do it. And, you know, like, I can understand I'm terrible at, you know, kind of this stuff myself, really. So I was reading through all these sections about get the students to organize a vocabulary notebook like that, and I'm like, yep, not going to work, they're not going to do it. Now that, I mean, I don't know. If somebody out there has had different experience than me, let me know. Prove me wrong. Maybe in your classroom vocabulary notebooks worked fine. But in my classroom it was a disaster. And in the school I was at, they gave up on it after kind of a year and a half. They just kind of quietly stopped doing it. On the other hand, there were some things in here which I thought were kind of very practical and very useful. Something point he makes in this book, and again this is coming away from like the revolutionary aspect of it and just kind of like, oh, you know, just a small change. He said, okay, you know, they're already doing reading in class, right? Like you're already giving them reading from the textbook or from a graded reader or whatever. He's like, just do these activities to help them notice the phrases or the collocations in the reading that they're already doing. And I thought, yeah, perfect. Because like they're already doing the reading anyways, right? So just bring in this activity and have them kind of find the collocations and the useful phrases themselves. And ideally, it will increase noticing of this. Now, whether or not it gets into their long-term memory is another question. And that's another question I guess I have about the lexical approach, is getting these kind of extended phrases into the learner's long-term memory. I've had frustrations with this in my own class. It's very easy to present them with phrases. It's very difficult to kind of get them to remember it, especially if you're in kind of a typical English as a foreign language setting and you're only meeting the students like a couple of times a week. You can get something into their long-term memory, but he in sections of this book, he is very ambitious about how much vocabulary he expects students to be kind of learning every day. I don't remember the figure, but he compares it to like the vast amount of vocabulary like a native child is learning at age 4, like 100 words a day or something like that. It's a struggle to get them to remember 10 words a week. I think you can present them with 10 words every lesson. In my experience, teaching in a private language school in a foreign language environment where you're only meeting them a few times a week. And you can drill that and you can get it to kind of some kind of like short-term memory by the end of the lesson. But to expect them to remember it week from week and then to kind of build on it, it's just hard to kind of build a vocabulary because they will just kind of forget things from week to week. You can drill new vocabulary. And I've tried with some of my adult students. This was kind of fresh off when I had finished the original lexical approach. I was dealing with a group of intermediate students, and my manager had warned me. Intermediate students often kind of get frustrated and drop out because they don't see their progress increasing as much as beginner students do. You kind of hit that intermediate plateau. And I thought, okay, I was fresh off of reading the lexical approach. I thought, Lexis, vocabulary, we can build on this, and this will be something recognizable that they will see that they're progressing on. And at the end of every lesson, I gave them 5 words as homework. They'd go home and kind of, in theory, they were supposed to go home and learn them, and then we'd build on 5 more, and by the end of it, we'd have all this vocabulary list that they had learned. And it was a disaster because, well, they weren't studying it at home. And then we were 5 words, and by the time we got to 10 words and 15 words, but by the time we got to 20 words, like they couldn't, it was just falling apart. They couldn't do the vocabulary activities in class. They couldn't remember it. So, yeah, I'm going off on a tangent there. I guess to kind of come back and kind of summarize the main points of this book, Michael Lewis is a very polemical writer. He argues against a lot of the things in the South. Actually, yeah, it's funny. We were at the book club meeting, and somebody said, the name The Lexical Approach is really not even a good name for this book because he goes off on so many tangents that are completely unrelated to Lexis. And I said, yeah, exactly, because I had made the exact same comment after reading the original The Lexical Approach. It's something I noticed when I was reading this book. And he does it again in this book. But I don't know. In a way, that's kind of half the fun of reading Michael Lewis, is just going off on these tangents with him. But like he has strong feelings that everybody is teaching English wrong, and he gets in these little jabs at things that arguably are not even kind of related to Lexis. But he does not like the PPP approach. PPP is a present, practice, produce. It's a lesson that kind of most beginning English teachers are taught in the CELTA. The idea that first you present a grammar point to the students, then they practice it, and then they're supposed to produce it by the end, like have a conversation where they use it. It's a very kind of simple method to train new teachers in, but the evidence is that it does not work because learning a language takes a lot of time. I've been noticing this kind of with my struggles with learning Vietnamese. I have all these vocabulary cards and I go through them and I practice them, and then when I sit down to have a Vietnamese conversation with somebody, I can't remember any of the words, right? Because to get them from kind of a controlled practice stage to where you're comfortable enough that you can produce it in real time and have those kind of those constraints on your working memory in real time to kind of recall those words or grammar points or whatever, it's quite difficult, and it's not realistic to kind of do it in a 90-minute lesson where you're like, okay, here's these vocabulary words that you've never seen before, like here's this grammar point you've never seen before, now we're going to practice it and all of a sudden you're going to produce it. Like the constraints on working memory, unfortunately, don't work that way. People need to be exposed to it for like a long period of time, need to start kind of gradually noticing it, kind of building up their receptive recognition of it over long periods of time, and then they start to experiment with producing it, and the first few times they're going to be making mistakes, but gradually they get stronger and stronger. And this, you have to be playing the long game with it. So I agree with Michael Lewis on this, I guess. That's something he takes a jab at. Other thing he doesn't like is he doesn't like the idea that, again, is taught on teacher training courses like the CELTA, that you always have to reduce teacher talking time. The CELTA and other training courses are of the opinion that if the teacher is doing all the talking, the students aren't getting any practice. Plus, they'll be thinking about something else or something. So you have to make the courses more student-centered, and you have to reduce the amount of time that the teacher is talking. Michael Lewis, I think he's kind of coming off of crashing on this. He says, no, we learn a language by listening to it. And if the teacher is talking, then the students are listening, so they're learning. Now, he says like there's helpful teacher talking time and there's unhelpful teacher talking time. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but I think a rough rule of thumb is anytime the students are not paying attention, it's not helpful teacher talking time. Because you have to be paying attention for it to kind of register it all as input. That's kind of my own definition of a helpful teacher talking time. But he says like if it's kind of good directed teacher talking time that's at the student's level, he uses Krashen's terminology of roughly tuned input. So roughly tuned at the student's level. And if it's something that they're interested in and relevant to them, then they're learning from it. So he says, kind of increase the anecdotes you kind of tell in class and stuff like that. Tell them stories, and they'll be learning from that. The other thing he says, which is controversial, is he doesn't like error correction. Now, in the CELTA and other teacher training courses, you're taught not to do error correction while the students are speaking because, it interferes with their fluency. So you're not supposed to stop them and correct them while they're speaking. But the CELTA says, you write down all the mistakes they're making, and at the end, then you kind of write it on the board and kind of highlight the mistakes and give them correction on it. Michael Lewis does not like that. He doesn't even, he says, I think in the original lexical approach, says delayed error correction is just a bad compromise. It's like he's of the opinion that delayed error correction came about because teachers really wanted to correct students, but they knew they couldn't interfere with fluency, so they just snuck it in the back. He's like, best to get rid of it entirely. I've got opinions on that, but I'm out of time. So I'm going to have to just shut myself down here and finish this review.